Is the world heading for a recession? More and more economists seem to think so, but can the damage be mitigated, or is a painful reset on its way? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the global economy. Just a few days ago, a U.S. research firm reported a 98% likelihood of a global recession. Similar odds were given back in 2008 and again in 2020 when the world faced what we hoped were once-in-a-lifetime economic conditions. Among the causes of our current financial problems are a combination of high inflation leading to rate hikes, as well as the conflict in Ukraine. But as food prices soar and stock portfolios plummet, should we move to get financial markets back to the status quo, or just hit the reset button? Should the world's economies prioritize the environment over growth, redistribute wealth to reinvigorate a collapsing middle class, and maybe, most controversial of all, regulate the banks and corporations that seem to get richer while the majority suffers? Now, before we put those questions to our panel, let's first take a look at what the world's biggest economies are doing ahead of this potential storm.
It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but if a global recession strikes, it'll affect real bread and butter issues for most of the planet. The divide between the haves and the have-nots will widen, prices will balloon, and the job losses are likely to be staggering. Optimists, beware. A look at history will show that the world's top economies don't have the best track record of preventing such a calamity. But try, they seem to be doing. The U.S. Federal Reserve is taking aim to cool off inflation, which was at a 40-year high in America. But there's no one way to do that.
It would be nice if there were, a way to just wish it away, but there isn't. We have to get supply and demand back into alignment, and the way we do that is by slowing the economy.
In September, the Fed raised its interest rate by 0.75 of a percentage point. It's the third such increase in a row, and it's a tactic that follows an economic philosophy which argues it's better to weather some pain now than watch it get out of hand later. U.S. President Joe Biden also signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act. It lowers some prescription drug prices, raises tax rates on corporations, and increases healthcare subsidies.
And all this progress is part of our vision and plan and determined effort to get the job done for the American people, so they can look their child in the eye and say, honey, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay.
Although critics inside Biden's own party say the legislation doesn't go far enough. Meanwhile, Germany and France have their own plan. Paris announced a $44 billion package to protect businesses and households from soaring energy prices. And in Berlin, the Bundestag earmarked more than $195 billion. They also cut sales taxes on petrol for small and medium-sized companies.
It's meant as a contribution for energy prices to come down quickly so that everyone notices it, and that no one needs to worry when they think about autumn, winter, about Christmas, about next year, and about the bills.
But China is following a different path. In August, Beijing unexpectedly cut interest rates. The aim is to stimulate growth after the government's strict zero-COVID policy, which slowed down the economy. Similarly, Japan has maintained its long-standing policy of keeping interest rates below zero. Many think this is why the yen has plunged to a new 24-year low against the dollar. While that keeps Japanese exports cheap for foreign buyers, it's also hurting the pocketbooks of Japanese citizens when they pay for their food and energy bills. Nevertheless, the Bank of Japan's governor defended the monetary policy.
It is necessary to support the economy and ensure we achieve our inflation target in a stable, sustained manner accompanied by wage growth. Therefore, it is appropriate to maintain our easy monetary policy.
And in terms of inflation, analysts say that policy seems to be relatively successful. While some countries have seen inflation rates in the double or triple digits, Japan has held its inflation to around 2.5%. But will it protect the country from a global recession? And for that matter, will Germany, France, or the US be successful? Well, the answer to those questions might be just a few months away.
So, what might be in store for our global economy, and can financial authorities stave off the worst effects of a potential global recession? Joining me now to debate that are from London, Vicky Pryce. She is an economist and a board member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Also in the British capital is Rajneesh Narula. He's an economics professor at the University of Reading. And from Bangkok is economist and author Steve Keen. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's first establish where each of you stands on how bad it might get. Steve Keen, I'll start with you. Is a global recession just inevitable?
I think it is, and not just for a single reason, but for a whole host of reasons. The most important being energy. We're seeing what happens when you take energy out of an economy. There's no economy left. At the same time, we have rising interest rates, partly in reaction to the rising costs of production courtesy of COVID and supply chain disruptions. And that's an action by central banks which will actually make a crisis more likely, while doing, I think, very little, if nothing, quite possibly, to reduce the rate of inflation. So we have a physical cause from energy, which we really haven't had on this scale ever before, and central banks caught in a total flummox, putting up interest rates to try to control inflation when it's not been driven by demand pressures, which is their usual problem, but by supply.
Okay, why do you think they're getting that wrong?
Well, basically, if you give an economist a nail, they'll hit it with a hammer, and their hammer is the models they have of the economy known as dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, in which they have what they call a Taylor rule, which simply says if we put up the rate of interest twice as fast as the rate of inflation is changing, we'll bring the inflation back down to 2%. It's a total myth. It didn't work back in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. It hasn't worked since. They've never hit the target, and yet that's what they still believe because it's the only tool they have. So inflation cannot be suppressed when it's being caused by rising costs. And that's what's actually going on this time round, both because of the energy effect and also because of the impact on COVID on far too extended global supply chains.
Interesting perspective. Rajneesh, as a fellow economist, do you agree with Steve there?
Certainly, we have the makings of a global recession, but I suspect that it will not be a global one. We will have parts of the world which will go, well, there'll definitely be a slowing down. Whether the slowing down will be even across countries, I don't think so. So Europe, the United Kingdom certainly, perhaps North America, and following in their footsteps, Africa and Latin America, will all slow down quite considerably. I do not think it'll extend all the way to Asia. Why do I believe this to be the case? I think that China is a very big factor. We're not quite clear where things are going. The property bubble may or may not burst. That will fundamentally change things. The extent to which they follow a zero COVID policy that they followed this far and how long they can maintain this will affect things. But a number of these countries are insulated because of domestic demand, that they do not necessarily, are not driven by the same types of inflation.
Like who, Japan?
Yes, so Japan, China, India, these are countries that are somewhat insulated from the world economy. They have a large enough domestic demand that they can afford. They're not driven by the same pressures as Europe. And I suspect that we have been hit by three very large exogenous shocks: the war in Ukraine, we have had COVID, and of course the UK has had Brexit, which is now factoring in quite nicely into all of these problems.
Okay, Vicky, let's get your thoughts on what you've heard so far. And I mean, do you think that it doesn't necessarily have to be a global recession and that some countries will be hurt far worse than others? In fact, some, according to Rajneesh, may even be able to avoid the worst kinds of consequences.
It's interesting that Brexit was suddenly mentioned, and of course the situation in the UK is worsened by the fact that we've had supply chain issues which are worse than others because of the reduction, if you like, in the trading that we were doing with Europe. I think that's quite important. But yes, there are going to be differences. I mean, if you look at all the forecasts that have been made so far, the vast majority of countries have been downgraded for 2022, which is almost over, and 2023. The ones that haven't tend to be the commodity producers. So there's going to be a big, big difference between those that are buying the various products and those that are actually producing them and selling them. So that is one big difference that we're going to see. But what we're seeing globally is that PMIs, the Purchasing Managers Index, in other words, the indication of where output is right now across the globe, is slowing down. And it's almost got to stagnation level. Yes, there are differences between, and we could say global. It's never global in the sense of all countries going down at the same time. When we saw the financial crisis, it moved from country to country as the crisis became, if you like, exported elsewhere. So we had it in the West, and then it became more of a problem for the BRIC countries. We've had similar issues with COVID. So we had a reduction first in those that closed down earlier, like China, and then they recovered, and then the others caught up and started their own downward decline. So what we've got, nevertheless, is that overall the stimulus isn't there.
Right. I mean, Vicky, specifically in the UK, you know, it's now expected to be one of the worst performing developed economies only after Russia, which is under very heavy financial sanctions. What happened?
Well, the UK took a bit of time to recover from where it was with COVID, but everyone had a bit of a bounce back. Lots of countries did the same. I mean, the interesting thing about the UK is that indeed, Brexit has not helped. There've also been very substantial shortages because the way that the economy recovered, there was a lot of mismatch, if you like, in terms of where people were. Lots of people exited the market.
But even after that, I mean, people were still expecting the economy to catch up and to grow. And now it seems like with tax cuts on the table for some of the wealthiest Britons, now we're seeing some real problems.
No, but it's interesting. Even before the latest, changes that have taken place, latest market sort of concerns that everybody has had, the UK was down on a sort of quite slow growth path, which is quite surprising given that the UK was less dependent on gas from Russia than others. In fact, most of it was either internally generated, if you like, or was coming from Norway. So what we've seen is there is an underlying reduction in sort of productivity in the UK and growth, and there hadn't been any real investment taking place to make up, if you like, for all the cuts that we had seen before, particularly since Brexit. So it was on a very slow path.
Steve, let me come back to you, and I want to go back even further, if we can, and ask if we have been consciously postponing the inevitable by living off superficially low interest rates for decades now, kind of printing money, as they like to say. So is it now just a matter of time before the global economy will demand kind of the massive reset we've heard mentioned in certain cases, which could leave things to get much worse before they can potentially get better?
Well, what has actually happened with low interest rates is that all the money which private banks create has gone into creating asset bubbles. You have enormous asset prices, particularly housing, but also share markets all around the world. And that was deliberate policy by central banks, what they call quantitative easing, which was really giving non-bank financial institutions large amounts of money in place of the bonds they used to have, basically saying, well, please go and buy risky assets, otherwise known as shares. And that drove up share prices dramatically. And of course, the whole economy became dependent on that, particularly house prices as well. So if you now have interest rates going from 0 as reserve rates up towards 4%, and mortgage rates going from 2 towards 8%, there are many, many people who are going to be unable to afford their mortgages. And that will feed back into the real economy because there will be a collapse in credit. That is the main danger in terms of the financial sector. And yes, the central bank set us up for this by not understanding money and by not understanding what would happen with quantitative easing when they basically inflated asset markets in the belief they generate a wealth effect, which their own research showed doesn't actually exist.
And Rajneesh, has that led to this pattern over the last 2 decades of punishing savers and rewarding those who just spend beyond their means?
Well, I don't know if this is, I take as severe a view as was just described. We can't put all of this at the central bank's feet. There has been consistent underinvestment by many governments, not all, depending upon the country, in building up key infrastructure, investing in human resources, building up human capital, and so forth. So this is, on the one hand, I mean, money isn't everything. What drives economic development is the investment in people, investment in knowledge infrastructure. That's what drives economies. And there's also been a persistent underinvestment in certain countries, the United Kingdom being a key example of this, where government has underinvested in these things. So they take the surplus that comes from other parts of the economy, and then this has disappeared in various forms, but not into productive assets. So we see this happening in certain countries, but not in all countries. So I mean, with China, we see certainly that it's a very different type of economy from what Steve has been describing.
Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. China is very different because China really has had an attitude of being a country building state. I was in China back in 81, 82. I saw the very beginnings of the export-oriented industrialization there, and the incredible focus upon engineering and technology and building the infrastructure of the country, and it's still doing it. So the West has actually got caught up in the bean counter mentality, that it's really important not to create government money, otherwise known as run a deficit. And that has actually degraded the infrastructure and the resilience of the West. So I certainly agree that China, by having a nation-building attitude, is in a much stronger position. But all of us are vulnerable to the decline in the availability of energy, and that is coming no matter what. And that's the really major danger we face. We have drastically overshot the capacity of the planet to handle the human imposition on the planet, and that will force us all to go into reverse. The ones that are better placed for that, the ones like China.
Steve, if I can ask you this, though, I mean, for the layman like me, you know, after 2001, we saw interest rates start to go down eventually, you know, to nothing. And more than 20 years later, they've never really come back up until now it's starting to inch up. I mean, I remember getting 8.5% on CDs at local banks in the United States back in the 90s, and the economy was good back then. I mean, how did we go from a model that seemed to be working, that rewarded savers, to where we are still 20 years later?
Largely because mainstream economists ignore the role of private debt in the economy. This has always been my research focus, that credit is a huge part of aggregate demand and income. And central banks have instead obsessed about the level of government debt, as did governments themselves, trying to reduce government debt. And what that means is governments create less fiat money, which means the private sector goes to the private banks to borrow credit-based money, and almost all of that money, rather than going to productive enterprises it should go, I completely agree with that point, it's gone into inflating asset bubbles. And banks are very happy to do this. It's a great way to make money while the bubble rises, then it bursts. I was one of the ones to warn of the bursting of the bubble in 2008 before it occurred, because I saw the rate of growth of private debt was too high to be sustainable, and it had to stop. And when it stopped, that's what's happened. And the central banks and the mainstream economists still don't understand it. They're still doing the wrong thing.
Rajneesh, I can see you. Yeah, okay, Vicky, go ahead. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to just come in because of the China issue, and also, you know, what's been happening in central banks. I mean, China private debt has gone up very significantly. I mean, yes, we've heard that apparently they've done the right thing, but you've seen the credit creation that's taken place and the problems right now that they're having with the property market in particular.
Very true.
So it's not all sort of good news from that point of view. But also, there have been two factors that have, if you like, sort of shaped the way that central banks have behaved. One has been the globalization that we've seen and China's role, how prices have been coming down for all sorts of goods, have been kept very low. And this whole, monetary policy stance of banks, which have kept rates low, has been because of that. It's not because they've done anything major themselves, but because basically the global economy was seeing lower inflation overall because of that expansion in globalization that we've seen. But we've seen also the very significant contribution that central banks have made to taking us through COVID. Yes, we can say that maybe they overdid it. But in reality, if they hadn't been for huge amounts of quantitative easing we've seen everywhere, whether that was in the US, whether in Europe, in the UK, whether in Japan, that has kept yields low and funded, if you like, the government debt that countries are prepared to accumulate.
I disagree.
Without that, without that, interest rates would have been considerably higher, and that recovery from COVID would simply not.
Okay, Rajneesh, I did see you sigh at a few points. Steve, I'll come right back to you, but let me get Rajneesh in because you looked a bit exasperated for a moment there. Go ahead.
No, I think we're just focusing too much on and putting too much blame on the banks. This isn't only about interest rates and banks making decisions. This is about states making wrong decisions. And systematically, you know, government policy isn't just about monetary policy and fiscal policy. There has been across, in the developing world certainly, a tendency to go around borrowing money on the assumption that commodities will stay high. And we've seen a massive debt build-up in Latin America, in Africa, where governments have gone out borrowing money and spent this money on the principle that, you know, commodity prices will remain high and we can pay it back later on. So even before COVID hit us, there was all this bubble going to happen in terms of third world debt that was rising and rising, with productivity falling in many of these countries in every other industry except in the commodities. And now this tendency also was there in Eastern Europe and so on. So what we're actually seeing here is not necessarily about quantitative easing and so forth, but we're paying for our fiscal and economic crimes, if you will, from the earlier in the 2010s and 2020s, where we've been borrowing money, we've been assuming that growth is infinite and continuous and the principles will not change. But we haven't made any adjustments. So now we're actually going through a period of adjustment to the last 3 years, 4 years with COVID. What we should have seen happening in 2019 before COVID, what would have happened as a slowdown, is now happening at double the rate of what it would have happened had COVID not happened.
Okay. Steve, if I can ask you this, I mean, really, given the conditions of the last few years, you know, not least, of course, the pandemic really shutting down the entire planet, some might actually say we're doing pretty well and that we will never see a return to the conditions of the Great Depression, for example. So what we are seeing, a predicted recession coming, is just what should be expected. And we should actually be pretty proud of the way the globe has managed its economy.
Except for climate change. And this is the absolutely essential point, which we're still not comprehending properly, and the role of energy in that. And this is what we're now striking. We have continued on as if the planet can handle any level of human imposition on the biosphere, and that is manifestly not the case. So when this starts striking, we'll find we were doing the wrong thing by ignoring climate change. And frankly, on that point, the most important group misleading us about the dangers of climate change were economists, specifically William Nordhaus for the Nobel Prize in 2018. Their work on climate change has been utter nonsense, totally delusional, and that has led us to get into a situation where we're now seeing the sort of energy and climate effects we're seeing around the planet.
Okay, I mean, just a quick word then. I mean, if it is really as bad as you say, what are you expecting to see? Does the world just end?
The world has climate crises which end up destroying the capacity for a sedentary civilization. That's what I'm afraid of. If you take a look at the photographs coming out of Florida right now, which is right on the path of the cyclones, the Cyclone Ian being the one which has devastated in the last couple of days. Those sorts of storms and that level of energy in the biosphere is a product of us letting carbon dioxide levels get far too high.
Okay.
Economists treated that like just making it a bit warmer. The energy itself will mean we can no longer maintain sedentary civilization.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, Vicky, sorry, do you think economists are ignoring the consequences of climate change and what's to come at their peril? Or do you feel Steve's assessment there is severe, as Rajneesh put it?
I think it's far too severe. I think loads and loads of economists understand what's happening. In fact, I work with Nick Stern, Lord Stern now, when I was working for the government. Who actually calculated the cost of not doing anything now, and that has changed very dramatically the way that people feel. But of course, what is going on right now with the war in Ukraine has focused minds. So one could be reasonably optimistic. Yes, for the short term, we probably need to rely more on coal, which is going on right now in Europe, but also on nuclear. But there is and there will be a continuous push for renewables, because obviously with gas being cut off from Russia,
Okay.
that makes a huge difference to where people may see energy sources coming from in the future. So I'm actually quite optimistic.
Okay, Rajneesh, you've got a minute and a half for your final thoughts.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to say here is that, you know, we're going through a transition process, and the world economy is going through a transition. I agree that climate change is important, but there are so many different priorities, multiple conflicting priorities that governments face and banks face. I'm not really going to get into which one comes first, but I think that we are looking at 2 or 3 years of adjusting to the new realities. But you know, to some extent, this is putting out fires, and being proactive is much more difficult, especially with exogenous shocks, as we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay. I will let you, Rajneesh Narula, have the final word there because the clock is against us. We are unfortunately out of time for this very insightful edition of the Newsmakers. Looking forward for the global economy and what's to come. Thanks all my panelists so much, Vicky Pryce and Steve Keen as well, for joining us there. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.